I have this interface that I want to refactor. I want to redesign it for the most part and give it a more consistent look and feel. Look and feel refers to how the elements on the page generally work together and how you can navigate through the different pages if there are those. Right now there aren't really different pages, but there are different parameters. For example, this zoom parameter, where if I go back and try to zoom, it won't actually do anything. And in this case, the zoom parameter makes it possible to change the scale of the nodes and also their charge. So in terms of being able to represent ideas, a lot of these functions are actually pretty useful because I can generate nodes of a specific size and then see how they relate to each other. These might be two different concepts from two different perspectives. And then I can add new nodes and describe their relationships that way. But as you can see, if I'm trying to access these nodes over here, I can't actually do anything besides select the text because how do I describe this? It has a higher z-index priority. I'm not sure if that's the right terminology. But essentially, it is in front of the elements that create the SVG, which means that when I try to interact with that part of the SVG, I'm not actually reaching it. Same thing with this area next to the buttons. So one of the things that I might want to do is add a toggle, like we see down here for hotkeys. It makes it possible for me to do something like add nodes or clear the active nodes, something like that. What else? These buttons aren't labeled, and I don't really mind that because if I'm going to make this into the other sites that I want to bring it into, for lore.land, honk.land, bonk, bone, bane, and boon.land, all of those I want to have their own personality. So I think that I want to leave those buttons unlabeled and let the code speak for itself in terms of how those buttons interact with the environment. But right now I can set the general tone. It's called the data index of the site. And this is for the entire website right now. There isn't much scoping that goes on to it. Well, I can't say that. It is kind of scoped. In terms of the JavaScript, the concept of a data index is scoped to the element, in terms of the styling. So the thing that gets us the red outline for the node that we're on, this is done with CSS, and the JavaScript knows to set that on the body. So if we were to have multiple different SVGs in the body element, then we would probably just set it on the parent container for the SVG. So that is something that we could do. But right now, this concept of a data index is site-wide and changes the behaviors of the nodes that we add. I don't mind that being not very well described because these buttons might do different things on all of the different sites. But in terms of how people would use it on factshift.com, which might be a communication tool, for example, it's useful for using swoop because I can generate, this is one node in a specific color. Oops. You can see that here. And I can change the color. Let's make that teal. This is another node. So in terms of representing perspectives, that's actually pretty useful as is, but it isn't well described, and the tab index of the entire site is really weird, I would say. Not really weird. It goes through all the buttons first, which aren't necessarily the things that I would want to do. It might be. I can see myself wanting to set the mode pretty often, but those aren't the first buttons that I get to. It takes me a lot of clicks to get to those buttons actually. And then I go through all of the nodes before I get to the hotkeys. I also don't know when this mode is set. It's not very clear when that's selected, but the toggle is pretty useful. It does the same things as the other buttons. What else? The color scheme in general is very eclectic. Personally, I like it because it makes the buttons feel distinct, and it doesn't give me any assumption that they're related at all. Like the Boon, Bane, Bone, Bonk, and Honk buttons don't do the same thing clearly. The toggle bounding box button and the bone button, as well as this red data index button, are kind of confusing because they're the same color, and there's somewhat of an implication that they have something to do with each other, similar with the teal button that is used for Bane and setting the mode to null. In terms of actual interaction, there are a variety of parameters that I can see over here. These are all of the parameters that, not all of the parameters, the main parameters that control how the simulation behaves. And some of these are literally in the, they're specified as the name of the query string parameter that you would want to use. So for example, if I set the width to 500, then there's the width where I can set the size to 500 by 500, and that does both. I can set the center, whoops, to 100, 100. And this should change where these nodes want to aggregate. So if I save these nodes, refresh the page, then change this to something like 1000 or 100, 1000, you can see that they go to the bottom. And if I toggle the bounding box, then they go away. If I change the center to, let's say 250, toggle the bounding box, and change the charge to 100, and I should start going towards that center point. What else? Let's go through all of the modes. So we have swoop mode, which we've already seen. With these, the relationships are added, but the fixed positions are not until you refresh the page, which is something that could be fixed. In node mode, we have the ability to specify an array of nodes, which can be convenient. Paste those. So that can be handy. We can generate new nodes, which can be useful for just representing the concept of a different perspective or something that interacts with a thought, with a concept. Here are the nodes. What does read do? Oh, it reads from the node input over here. I think, yes. And we can fix positions and free them with this button. Stop the simulation, take the simulation, start the simulation. And I think the reinit button, it runs the reinit function, which is also run when we do things like click on the unzoomed. When we click on the unzoomed simulation. Is there anything else that I want to describe? The other modes. There's a map mode, which allows you to interact with the nodes directly. Change the radius, for example. There's the filter mode. Whoops. How does that work? I see. That's interesting. I'm not sure why I decided to code it that way. Ah, right. And then there's some weird thing with copying and pasting, where if I, for example, have a whole bunch of nodes, and then I do Control-C, Command-C since I'm on a Mac, then the thing that's on my clipboard is all of the IDs of the nodes that exist, which isn't necessarily intuitive. It isn't described many places. It would also be kind of hard to summarize because there are a few different key down handlers, and some of those come from the questions that they ask about which keys you're pressing are dynamically set. I can actually pull that up here. Controls. So at the bottom, there's this keystroke options, which is opaque. This can be set by the user, and there wouldn't be a way for me to guess the kinds of keystroke options that have been set here. I do know that in this particular case, only one of these keys can really be considered because we're checking to see if the specific key is being pressed. And there are a few other things that are commented out that I can't necessarily say that I won't add back in. For example, something that I removed was adding nodes based on the space key, because while it was convenient, while I was typing in swoop, this is something interesting. It would be adding spaces nodes when I typed a space. So I added this Bane button to remove all the extra nodes. And that's a solution on top of the problem without actually addressing the problem, which is that in this box, all of the events that are related, basically I shouldn't propagate the events that are happening in this swoop box, except if I want to minimize this, just from a usability perspective. What else? What is keyboard shortcuts? Query. This shows the query parameters. Right now, one of the problems with this is that I can submit this form and set these query parameters, and that can be handy for if I want people to specifically know. Right now, the superpower shrink. that they can interact with this interface in a specific way, I can give them a form and say, all you have to do is go to this query form and submit it, and it should be okay. Like, you should be able to do the thing that you want to do. So that's kind of okay. I don't mind this being preset with values that have nothing to do with what is in the query parameter string. The query string, I should say. There's also this other input that I can't access unless I tab to it. That allows me to set some of the query parameters. So for example, bounding box is 0. And that changes the bounding box without actually changing the URL. And that's pretty convenient to have that ability. But as you saw, I think that also changed the mode. This says the mode is query. So something about submitting that specific form or running that, I'm not sure what it is. If it's like changing something, if I'm running some sort of function on change and then just keeping that change, or if it's a form that's being submitted. I don't know. There's also something weird that I added there. Let's see if I can get to this quickly. Where if you hold the shift key while you're clicking go, then it changes the URL parameters. And as you see, instead of there being a comma where I would expect there to be a comma, there's the %2c sign, which seems to be accurately getting parsed. No, it isn't. So there's something that's going on with local storage. No? Why is this the case? Size 100%C. So I think it's just ignoring what's coming after that. Size 1000. Sure. Why is that not changing? That's interesting. Oh, I think it's because of the ways that I have the SVG set up. One of the frustrating things is that I can't do Command-Shift-C to inspect element because I have Command-C doing the thing that I mentioned earlier with copying the node IDs. If you look at this, width 500, 500. I'm not sure why that is happening. Size 500, 100. So this is something that I would want to change. It's going to clear local storage just to make sure, which also changes the URL. So there are specific quirks that I can't easily look into because there are so many systems that are affecting the way that I can interact with this interface, the look and feel. It does all the things that I would want it to do for my own purposes, because my own purposes are primarily to compare this is one thing. Oop. Parse. And then this is one thing. So these are my purposes, the thing that I would want to do with it most often. Compare two different perspectives, see Who said what first into that these nodes? Oh, there's also a click and drag thing which distributes nodes. It's kind of hard to see. Go to hotkeys. Oh, it's going to use control arrow. It distributes the nodes if I click and drag, which is only useful in one direction if I'm doing it in one direction. And there's a glitch where it doesn't actually register that I've done the mouse up if I'm off the SVG. So there's a lot that I would change if I wanted to actually make this useful. And also, naming these features and being able to describe to a team that this is the feature that we're updating and this is why is a challenge. For me, for my own purposes, this is more of, what is this? This is more of an internal tool for me to process my thoughts, but I recognize that it can be useful to other people. It'll be more useful to other people if I made this more accessible by adding labels and adding descriptions and clarifying what the behaviors are supposed to be, clarifying which things are supposed to be buttons, which things are supposed to be dialogues, stuff like that. But I haven't because I was using vanilla JavaScript, which has gotten me to a decent place, I would say. I made a video about a week ago, I want to say, where I was using Vim to code this, and then I started using an IDE. So I'm taking this from the very basic. I know that I want to code something, and I know that I have the ability to interact with these specific elements, and then incrementally adding things like VS Code, which is a free IDE, and then WebStorm, which is a paid IDE that I know a bit better and is a bit more intuitive for me to navigate. Then adding things like, what is this? Copilot, GitHub Copilot as well. So starting from the very beginning of, I have this idea and I want to make sure that it is exactly me interacting with the things that I know how to interact with using Vim, then VS Code, then WebStorm, and Copilot. So now I think the thing to do is to install Storybook, which is something that can be useful for communicating across teams about design ideas, design concepts, and also just to reference specific components with a URL. So instead of saying, I want all buttons to be this size, because these are buttons and these are buttons, they do different things and they're different places. If I were to try to communicate to a developer what I wanted to get done with this page, it would be easier for me to be able to point to a URL that says, I want the boon, bane, bone, bonk, and honk buttons. You can access them at this URL to be the same size as, for example, the toggle bounding box button. That's the language that I might use as a designer. I want to make sure that these buttons are as salient as the largest button is the core of the goal that I want to reach. But being able to reference URLs and say, these are the buttons that I want that to apply to, versus the charge or mode buttons or the color buttons or anything else. Being able to use that specific language is a lot easier with Storybook. And I think that's kind of where we're headed with these technologies. The difficult problems of communication are actually not very related to our lack of ability to use technology. Communication isn't a hard problem because we don't have technology that addresses why it's hard. It's a hard problem because a lot of communication doesn't actually depend on idea exchange. Anyways, yeah. So that's where I'm headed with this interface in a bit more detail. I'm going to probably be going through the process of refactoring this based on the things that I've acknowledged in this video. The goals that I have are to make all of these elements more cohesive. Again, that's the look and feel of these sites. I want to make easier, more intuitive for people who aren't me to interact with them. So doing things like making the hotkeys more consistent, making these buttons more descriptive, adding labels to different elements, making the tab index more consistent, making decisions about if I want to be able to tab to nodes, how quickly I want to do that, what I want the shift key to do, how I want to alert events, how I want to do dialog boxes or debug mode, stuff like that.